Welcome back to Smitty's Learning Room. Today we continue to have a look at the focus question in Core 2, how can psychology affect performance? And we move on to the dot point today relating to anxiety. So when we look at the syllabus, again, we look at the focus question, how can psychology affect performance? And we come down to the dot point, anxiety and arousal. And we're looking at these concepts, trait and state anxiety, sources of stress, and optimal arousal. So this video will take us through these aspects of anxiety and arousal. So we need to remember that we're looking at a whole lot of different concepts here in relation to how can psychology affect performance. In our previous video, we had a look at how motivation can affect performance. This video, we're going to have a look at how anxiety affects performance. And the next one, the last video, we'll look at psychological strategies to enhance motivation and manage anxiety. So when we look at anxiety is a heightened level of emotion which occurs in response to a real or perceived threat. So as we already know, anxiety is an emotion that we experience as humans, that when we think that something is actually going to happen to us or there's actually a real threat there. So sort of when an athlete might experience fear or is concerned about something, and examples about that can be the loss of a game or not scoring enough points, that sort of thing. So when we look at anxiety, we have two types of anxiety. We have what we call trait and state anxiety. Now, trait anxiety refers to the characteristics of a person. So if that person is just normally an anxious person or someone who worries about something, they're probably going to suffer more levels of anxiety than what someone who is maybe a little bit less concerned with the results of the game or the outcome or the skill. Now, athletes are going to have varying levels of trait anxiety, and because of that, there's going to be lots of different ways that athletes can deal with that, and they can implement strategies to deal with their personal levels of anxiety. The other type of anxiety is state anxiety. Now, state anxiety is anxiety which arises due to a particular activity. So if an athlete is, say, perhaps reaching the final series of a competition, their anxiety levels prior to the game or during training might increase because of the pressure from external sources, such as having to win a premiership or the trophies or rewards that go with winning those premierships. And as it says here, they're usually around high pressure moments. So for example, a free shot on goal in a soccer game or a three-pointer in basketball. So it's sort of the state anxiety is that anxiety that we get with the pressure of something that's coming up, as opposed to that sort of our personal characteristics about stressing or worrying about something. So when we look at anxiety, it's important to have a look at the sources of stress, because stress is unavoidable in life, and we know from 7 to 10 health that we have positive stress and negative stresses, and sources of stress may be intrinsic, such as so intrinsic being our personal things, okay, such as the pressure we put on ourselves to perform at a high standard, or extrinsic, such as a crowd yelling and shouting at us, or the expectations of parents and coaches and supporters. And there's going to be lots of different sources of stress out there that are going to be sort of different for everybody. So, where one person might have the stresses of a parent and their high expectations, another athlete may not have those expectations from their parents, or the expectations that come from them may not actually be a source of stress for them. So it's important for athletes to identify the source of their stress so that specific strategies can be implemented so positive outcomes are achieved. So if an athlete denies the fact that the expectations of coaches and parents and friends is something that's stressful for them, they won't be dealing with their stress, and therefore their performance will continue to be decreased as a result of this. So it's important for athletes to focus on positive thoughts, positive outcomes, and obviously sharing their concerns around levels of stress that they're experiencing. So the final concept we have a look at when we're looking at the anxiety dot point is arousal or optimal arousal. Now, arousal is an athlete's readiness to perform and incorporates a person or an athlete's mental and physical state of being. Now, individuals experience some level of arousal at all times. In a sporting context, the challenge is to identify the level of arousal most likely to bring about peak performance. This level of peak performance is called optimum arousal. When we look at the concept of optimum arousal, we look at the inverted U hypothesis, which is what this graph shows here. And we can see here that we can either be under-aroused or over-aroused, and this obviously has an effect on our performance. Because it's essential for an athlete to be working at this peak performance level or in this area of optimum arousal, there are certain strategies that we have to apply to try and increase arousal, but also decrease the arousal if the arousal is too high. So when we have a look at arousal raisers, so things that actually increase our excitement or our readiness to perform, we can look at the increasing of voice intensity. So for example, a coach might be having a conversation with an athlete and speaking to them a little bit louder. Loud noises such as clapping or cheering or chanting from a crowd will often get an athlete going. A hand gesture, so for example, things such as thumbs up and high fives to players will also encourage players to be ready to perform. Sometimes before the game or as substitutions are coming on and off, an introduction to the crowd can also be another way to increase arousal. And finally, obviously, physical activity, because of the endorphins that are released during physical activity, this can also be a way to increase arousal. Now, on the other side, when arousal begins to get too high, this can obviously decrease performance if it starts getting too high. So what we need to do is ensure that we encourage focus. So as coaches and athletes, we focus on the task at hand and try not to be disrupted or become too aroused in relation to the activity we're doing, and to focus on performance rather than the outcome. So what are the steps that I must complete before that outcome? So instead of a golfer thinking, I must get, a par or a hole in one or something, they break that down, each hole down to say the drive, and then, the play on the green, and then obviously up into the hole. So breaking tasks down instead of that final outcome. Task familiarity, so obviously making sure that the athlete is completing a task that is familiar to them and it's something that's not completely new. Now, this is obviously concerning for an athlete if they come across a challenge that they've never seen before. This can cause quite high levels of anxiety and increase arousal to a point where the athlete cannot perform. Applying a consistent routine can also help athletes in the same way of task familiarity. If that an athlete is consistent with their training, they know what is expected of them, and therefore that they can complete at that peak performance. Another thing that athletes can do to ensure that they are at the optimum arousal level for peak performance is for calming techniques. So if an athlete becomes too aroused, often they may be removed from the field of play, or if it's an individual sport, you may see them listening to music or doing some visualization or mental rehearsal to try and decrease that level of arousal so that their performance can go back to peak performance. So remember that there are 3 videos in this series for this focus question: how can psychology affect performance? So far we've had a look at motivation and anxiety. And the next video will look at how psychological strategies are used to enhance motivation and manage anxiety.